what you mean? You don't eat no meat. So vegetarian slash vegan, we're kind of going over both today. Most people know what it is, but it's there are many types and there's many reasons, but generally speaking, a vegetarian is someone who does not eat meat or use any animal-based products. So these are the 4 reasons we're going to touch on today in our presentation on why people choose a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle. So religion, animal rights, environmental concerns, and then health. Hopefully these are some common myths and stereotypes that we hear a lot, and maybe we can discuss at the end. Feel free to ask us, and hopefully the presentation will address a few of them. But we do hear a lot that meat is the only source of protein. Not true. Vegetarians slash vegans only eat salad. Not true. Hopefully your lunch shows you that. Vegetarians are judgmental of non-vegans. I actually hear that one a lot. So it's difficult to eat a vegetarian diet. So some people say they want to be vegetarian, but it's too difficult to do it. And then you always hear that, oh, I'm too much of a carnivore. I have to eat meat. So that is obviously a myth. So these are just some fun examples of historical figures who were vegetarian. Some of them I knew about actually, and some of them I was surprised by. I think Albert Einstein is kind of a cool one. And that's his quote at the bottom: nothing will benefit human health and increase chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet. And then these are just a few more current famous people that are vegetarian or vegan. And then on the right, the people in parentheses, I tried to put some athletes on there just so you can see that there are a lot of very strong, healthy athletes as well. Speaking of which, this is just an example of one. Yeah, he looks very malnourished, obviously. He's not getting protein or iron or those essentials. So real quick, we just wanted to touch on the religion aspect. The religious reasons can vary for people to not eat meat, but they're all kind of founded on that idea of peace and love and respect for all living beings. And most vegetarianism is linked to, religious-wise, is linked to religions or originating, in India. Not exclusively, but most of them. Some religions aren't necessarily vegetarian as far as part of the religion, but during some of their holidays or during certain events, people will choose to abstain from meat as part of their spirituality and religion. And then also a lot of yoga practitioners are vegetarian, and that can be for health reasons and also because most yoga schools teach you a lot of the Hindu principles of yoga, and so that would include like ahimsa, which is non-violence. So a lot of yoga practitioners and teachers apply that to these religions. Here's just some examples. All of these religions aren't necessarily vegetarian. The ones at the top are Jainism is required to be vegetarian as part of the tenets of that religion. Buddhism and Hinduism is not required, but huge percent of those religions are vegetarian. And then the rest of them are more just examples of where it's not actually a required tenet of the religion, but people can be and use their spirituality and religion to interpret it to mean not meaning. So Jamie and I are going to very briefly discuss the animal rights perspective. We promise it's brief. We do not put graphic videos or pictures or really go into detail. We more just want to give you a little bit of food for thought and kind of just, this is one perspective of why people choose to be vegetarian and vegan. So I just want to put a few points down for kind of the perspectives from people who do choose this for animal reasons. So animals are sentient beings. Humans are animals. Please don't forget. So livestock animals are mammals, just like we are mammals. And because of that, just like that point, animals have nervous systems, just like us. So they feel pain the same way that we feel pain. Again, that same idea. For mammals, what's the difference between a dog and a cow? Yet one is our pet and highly protected
They don't really focus on animal welfare. So briefly, there are many issues for concern, especially related to animal welfare. But some of the main ones include inhumane confinement, cruel slaughter practices, environmental impact, and forced feeding. And just a little interesting background on legal protection of the factory farm animals. Animals that are raised for food are among the least protected class of animals in the United States. So actually, currently, the U.S. has no federal laws that protect farm animals while they are on the farms where they're raised. Right now, there are two broad federal laws that cover farm animals during transport and slaughter. Unfortunately, all birds are excluded from these animal protection laws, and because birds affect the vast majority of animals that are killed for food, largely there aren't laws protecting factory farm animals. So what can be done to reduce animal suffering? Some of these are kind of basic common sense, but increased awareness of current farming practices as well as expanded education about farming methods. Smart shopping. So a number of animal welfare product labeling programs are in place that set at least minimum standards of care for farm animals. So if you're shopping, if you see something that says certified humane, animal welfare approved, Global Animal Partnership, Fetal Alliance, or American Grass Fed, you know that you're at least buying a product that has a minimum standard of care for the animals that were raised for those purposes. And then obviously just a reduced consumption of animal products, food-based as well as non-food-based. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Robinson.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Dr. Robinson. I teach at SOMA, and I put these slides in here because this was my introduction to vegetarianism. These books were published in 1970 or 1971, and so when I became a vegetarian, let me just tell you, you would not have wanted to come to my house to eat. I was cooking out of books like this, and that's even a cookbook. It's Recipes for a Small Planet. They're just awful. So, I mean, this is really what you think of as the typical hippie brown rice and beans for every meal kind of thing. So, one I remember distinctly was brown rice nut loaf. I was supposed to simulate meatloaf, I guess. I was never a big fan of meatloaf, even when I did eat meat, and that was just an awful experience. But probably more this one on this side, The Diet for a Small Planet, was one of the first books to really bring home the point that there is an environmental impact of the animal-based diet. Okay, so now we think of that in terms of a carbon footprint, and so a carbon footprint is what do I do in my daily life that impacts the environment, and so that's measured usually in CO2 equivalents, or the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted by the things that I do, like driving a car or eating meals, because there is a lot of energy that goes into food production. And so this is one slide that's going to talk a little bit about that. It's not a very catchy slide or exciting because it's just some charts here, but it comes from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And this, if we just set the amount of protein we eat to 1, and so if the amount of protein you can get from soybeans, by the way, soybeans are complete protein. People get all excited about the amino acids and that some vegetables don't have a complete complement of amino acids, but soybeans do. And so soybeans are also high yield in the fact that you can grow a lot of soybeans per acre. And so land use, if we set the equivalent of protein for soybeans to 1, the land use that it takes to raise the same amount of protein from an animal source will be somewhere between 6 and 17 times the amount of land use for soybeans. Likewise for water, anywhere between 4 and 25 times the amount of water goes into animal production of the same amount of protein. And then the fossil fuel requirements. This is a pretty broad range here. Some of the more up-to-date information shows that, well, this is specific to protein, but for a calorie of food that we eat, it takes tenfold the amount of fossil fuels to produce animal-based calorie versus a plant-based calorie. And so this is how this breaks down. This is from the 2006 report from United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And so it turns out that the only sector that produces more greenhouse gases than livestock production is the energy production. So, a lot of times we think about pollutions from our automobiles, but if you take all of the transportation industry, and that's planes, trains, automobiles, buses, cars, airplanes, all that stuff, that's 14% of the CO2 emissions, which is even less than what we're talking about for production of livestock. And so if we want to break that down, we can look at this right here, and we can see that a great majority of this comes from, so this is greenhouse gases from beef production, and we can see a lot of it has to do with beef crops. And some of this has to do with the amount of food, land that is repurposed for animal livestock that could be used for farming. So it's important that cattle eat enough grain to feed 8.7 billion people. And that food is just put into the cows so that a smaller subsection of humans can eat. And then another important point is the greenhouse gases. And this is the emissions. This is what we see at the tail end of this cow. 32% of greenhouse gas emissions from cattle and their wastes. Okay, because we always need to limit on the dog. All right, so the next slide is just another graphic representation of the CO2 equivalent emissions from producing a piece of food. So the amount of emissions required to produce potatoes would be equivalent to driving a car with about 27 miles per gallon car, about 1.7 miles. And then down at the bottom, you can compare that to the amount of CO2 production and the equivalent of emissions based on beef production. Okay, so I put this slide in here. One thing I wanted to point out here is that it's not really part of this slide, but when we think about this region right here and the rainforests, since the 1970s, 20% of the rainforest land has been cleared, and at this point, 80% of that land is now used for livestock grazing. So that's sort of a double whammy as far as that goes. Now this map itself is pointing out the fact that there are areas where beef consumption is much higher, and that these demographics are shifting so that we here in the red areas are definitely not as a whole decreasing our meat consumption, but there are lots of developing countries that are now becoming more affluent and are trying to mimic our Western diet. That may not be a good idea, but that's going to drive an increase in beef consumption worldwide. I couldn't really decide which one of these graphs I wanted to put in here. They're similar. The one here on this side is really just looking at carbon intensity of the food supply. And you can see the beef, and for some reason, and I haven't found out why, lamb is much more carbon intensive even than beef production. Then this graph on the left is showing a breakdown that also includes something that a lot of people don't think about, and that's food waste. So in the retail industry and even in the consumer side of things, if you account for the amount of food waste that we just throw away, then that's all. We still have to expend the carbon intensity to get that food, even if we don't eat it. And so this is comparing different diets, and we'll see all the way here to the left, a meat lover's diet, and then we can see the environmental impact decreases as you cut out more and more of the animal products in your diet. And so when I compared, let me see if I can get the right page here. Here we go. Okay, so I have been a vegetarian for 27 years now, and so I'm this kind of vegetarian. I do eat some dairy and eggs, but when I compare just my carbon footprint here to just the average, not even the meat lover, but to the average, and I factor that over the 25 years that I've been a vegetarian, then I did some calculations, and I found out that the CO2 that I'm not responsible for, it would be enough for me to make 33 cross-country trips, or I could go 4 times around the circumference of the Earth in the amount of carbon that I have, I guess, that I'm not responsible for personally. So I feel like that is an accomplishment in my life. And so, but one thing I wanted to look at here and see is this. If we look at, like I said, I'm this kind of vegetarian. And so this dairy part right here is, it's part of my diet here, and it is adding to my carbon footprint. And so then I looked at this TED Talk. This guy he's a tree hugger. That's his blog name, Tree Hugger. And he's really a strong environmentalist, and he points out all of these reasons why he should be a vegetarian, and he just can't bring himself to do that. So he said, I've been pitched this binary idea that I either have to eat meat or I have to be a vegetarian, and he rejects that. So what he does is he's a weekday vegetarian. So during the week he's a vegetarian, and then on weekends he might have some meat. And so I'm taking that to heart, and I'm trying to eat more in the vegan lifestyle. So I'm probably never going to go full vegan, and that's okay. But if I can pick a day or two out of the week where I do just an entirely plant-based diet, then I can have an impact on the environment. Further. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Kenny now.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate you taking your time out of lunch. My name's Kenny. I'm a first-year medical student here at SOMA. And just as a show of hands, are any of you actually plant-based at all in the audience, besides us? One. All right, awesome. Good job. That's no joke. So, I open up, I'm talking about the health aspect. I've been a vegan for 12 years. Actually, right when I started, I just went full vegan, kind of cold turkey, no pun intended. But it worked. It worked for my lifestyle. So I opened up a slide and I said, what if there was a top secret way that you could help prevent, treat, or even reverse 15 out of the top 16 leading causes of death in the United States? Who would believe me? Anybody? There you go, a couple. Because obviously it's kind of tall. Lucky for you, it is. It's a plant-based diet. Simple dietary changes, and I'll go ahead and explain a little bit more about it. Every year, CDC comes out with a list of mortality, causes of death every year. And this is the most recent one right here. Heart disease, number one, the leading cause of death since about 1919. Just can't seem to shake it. Cancer, number two. Disease, right there. Actually, soon enough, the cancer is actually going to surpass heart disease, but for the time being, heart disease is still the wrong cause. So I looked at this and I decided, instead of pointing out some of the main health benefits, I figured I'd pick on some of the ways we die. And this is heart disease and cancer. So let's pick on those right now. So the 35-year follow-up from the Harvard Nurses Study, which is the longest running study of female health ever performed. Very, very definitive over the span of 30-some years. Since the study started, though, they published their follow-up. And what happened is, over the time, a lot of the women actually died. But what that allowed for is them to discover the risk factors for mortality. And what was interesting was, because heart disease was a leading cause for the women of dying, the second was cancer, so that kind of mirrored the CDC. It's no surprise that dietary cholesterol consumption was a significant risk factor for death. And now, I'll go ahead and just preface this. When I talk about cholesterol, cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease, but it's not the only risk factor. I don't have time to obviously touch on some of the other ones, but it's a very multifactorial disease. But cholesterol is very tied to a very big risk factor in that. So, anyhow, what was really neat, though, about the study is that it's something called a competing risks analysis study. And what this basically allowed them to do was compare one risk to another and put it kind of in a numbers format for each other. So what you see here on the left with the picture of the egg and the smoking is that the amount of cholesterol in a single egg a day, consumption of just one egg, they compared the risk with the same risk factor for dying as smoking 5 cigarettes a day for 15 years. Right there, right off the bat. And that's only one egg. If you were to consume the cholesterol in one egg, and nobody eats one egg. 2, 3, 4, 5. However, on the flip side, the decreased risk for death, you'll see there's a little bowl of opium. Everybody loves opium. So basically what they found is for the decreased risk side, the amount of, basically the protective measure was cereal fiber, and what you can find in a lot of plant-based foods. So a single cup of oatmeal, the fiber found in a single cup of oatmeal, was the same protective benefit of 4 hours of weekly jogging, which is, not that you can't do both, but still, even if you don't, you can be warm, and it can save you that amount. And that's just tied to longevity. So what's really important is, why do I talk about cholesterol? And the interesting thing about cholesterol is that cholesterol is only found in animal products, not found in plant products at all. However, on the flip side of that, fiber is only found in plant products. So you kind of have that on each side of the scale. So, you know, when you think about that, you have animal foods associated with an increased risk of death, and you have plant foods with a decreased risk of death. And I thought that was pretty profound. So, however, the one food I would say that was most tied to longevity appeared to actually be nuts. So 2 handfuls of nuts a week is about the same equivalent to 4 hours of weekly jogging. So pretty cool. So if you're snacking, grab a few handfuls of nuts per week. So, but you know, I think about this too. So sure, heart disease, #1 cause of death. But what if your cholesterol is normal? I know I hear it as just a student. I'm sure you do. You read it. You know, these are my guidelines. My doctor says my cholesterol is normal. So I have to break it to you though. When it's normal cholesterol in a society where it's normal to have a heart attack, it doesn't make much sense to me. So, a huge study last year, 66,000 people. This was actually done by a drug company. It wasn't anything related to nutrition. It was all about acute coronary syndrome, sudden cardiac death. What they found here, almost 75% of heart attack patients fell within the, quote, recommended guidelines. Does that even make sense? Why would it? And it said right there, demonstrating that the current guidelines may not be low enough to cut heart attack risk in most who could actually benefit. And specifically, when we talk about LDL cholesterol, say LDL usually L lousy, HDL healthy. So they actually, quote, met the guidelines as optimal. However, I'm not sure them or their grieving families would take much comfort in that fact. So again, remember, it's our #1 killer. Okay. So, you know, I thought about this, and I thought about, you know, well, having low cholesterol or below levels of what would be considered optimal is a decreased risk factor, but as an editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Cardiology said, it's time to stop just shifting from decreasing our risk to actually preventing and arresting atherosclerosis. This was over a decade ago. So you don't want low risk, you want no risk. How do you do it? He goes on to say, the build of plaque in our arteries to cease appears the serum total cholesterol needs to be lowered to the average about 150, right? Because we recommend in the US about 200 plus. He says 150. He knows a thing or two about this, obviously. He says, in other words, serum cholesterol of your average pure vegetarian. So when he says pure vegetarian, he means a vegan. But he uses the average pure vegetarian. So this is basically just a pictorial graph view of what you can see here on the left-hand side is your omnivores, and this is about the 200. This is what we would consider normal cholesterol in the US. And then as you go kind of down the sliding rule scale, you can see as you convert to less and less animal product, you go down and down your cholesterol to your average of 140. So he was talking about 150, and here's the vegans down here, and as you go, and you can kind of fall in this range if you adopt a plant-based diet. And similarly, LDL levels will precipitously drop as you go down and decrease your consumption of animal products. Because again, cholesterol is only found in animal foods. And of course your body makes cholesterol, but that's what you need for just normal hormone production. So, you know, and just in case you didn't want to take his word for it, another American Journal of Clinical Nutrition basically showed that vegans had total lower and LDL cholesterol than meat eaters did. But what was interesting is they said meat and cheese consumption positively associated with total cholesterol concentration, whereas dietary fiber was inversely related. Same thing that we were talking about right in the opening slide from Harvard Nurses study. They found the same thing. So I thought about this, and it's like, well, what are you going to do? Tell everybody to go on a vegan diet or a plant-based diet? It's impossible. Not everybody do it. We couldn't at least, but Finland did. So back in the 1970s, after World War II, Finland started packing on the meat, dairy, eggs, and by the 1970s, Finnish men actually had the highest rate of cardiovascular mortality in the entire world. They actually beat out the US. We usually like to take the cake for unhealthiness, pretty much in everything. So we actually lost this, but now when we don't, it's okay. We're back in the lead, so it's perfectly fine. So they didn't want to die, so they got serious. So remember, high cholesterol, you know, risk factor for heart disease, and most of that was coming from their high saturated intake of animal food. So for them it was cheese and chicken, pork, cake, so on and so forth. And a lot of the Finnish farmers that they were doing were dairy farmers. So the Finnish government actually launched a program to switch from dairies to berries. They actually kind of pitted the villages in these cholesterol-lowering competitions to really see who could decrease their risk for cardiovascular disease and mortality against each other. So how they do. So I thought about that, and I thought that if you're thinking of a public health or population scale, even 5% would make a huge difference. I mean, everybody's agreeing, I mean, even a small percentage, but a large amount of people, that'd be a profound effect. So how did they do it? Remarkable changes. And this blew my mind almost. So on the left-hand side, you can see here, so over 30 years, cardiovascular mortality decreased by 80%. 80%. 80%. 80%. So, you know, and I thought about that. So not only did they decrease that 80%, but because they decreased so much of the cardiovascular and cancer mortality just by reducing this, the all-cause mortality decreased by 45%, which translated into 7 years of longer life for men, 6 years for women, because they just did the data. And all that was just by cutting down from animal products. Nothing else. No exercise, no sleep differences, no lifestyle differences, just the diet alone. So let's get back to the official list. Let's pick on some cancer for a little bit. So we know that from the largest forward-looking study on diet and cancer ever performed, right there on the top right, this is the thing that I could just take and I could go home right now. Incidence of all cancers combined, lower among vegetarians and meat eaters. All cancers. Nothing excluded. Every single cancer. And actually, what was surprising to me is that some of the most aggressive cancers and fastest growing, so lymphomas, leukemias, things like that, were actually the most correlated to meat consumption. So for instance, poultry in some of the lymphomas it wasn't even red meat, it was poultry, was 9 times the risk by consuming 50 grams of poultry. So just in case you're not familiar with 50 grams in a food portion, but a quarter of a chicken breast. So a quarter of a chicken breast, triple your risk for lymphoma. You know, again, just like no one eats one egg, no one eats a quarter of a chicken breast. Or at least I don't. So, anyhow, moving along, up to Pritikin Research Group. They like to study what you call plant-based diets and disease. So I picked on breast cancer for women because it's the most common cancer for women, and then I picked on prostate cancer for men because it's the most common prostate cancer in men. So again, what they did here is the Pritikin Research Group was actually, when they studied this, they were following up on a study that had been previously done where they put people on a plant-based diet for a year, and then they followed up. However, the Pritikin Research Group didn't want to wait a year. They had 2 weeks on a plant-based diet. Right here on the right-hand side, we're looking at growth rates. So these are different cell lines of breast cancer cells, and that's basically just the fancy name for the type of breast cancer cell that we have. And you can see here, this on the left-hand side, the solid shaded is going to be your pre-plant, and then your hashed line is going to be your post-plant, so pre and post-plant. And even if you didn't understand anything, you can see that it drops on every single cell line. So what you see here is a 7% drop. You have a 10% drop, and you have a 19% drop, respectively. However, not even arresting growth, you look at apoptosis here, the actual cell death, the death of the actual cell. So not only are we suppressing the growth, but we're causing the current cells to actually undergo death. Programmed cell death, 20% drop, 23% drop, 30% drop. And this is from nutrition and cancer. Big article. Again, right here, pre-plant, post-plant. So the actual death increasing from pre and post-plants. The coolest thing that I thought about this was 14 days. Now, who couldn't, just say for instance you have maybe breast cancer might run in your family, or maybe you've been diagnosed with breast cancer. Who couldn't go on a diet for even 14 days to make changes? I know I could. So I think about men now, I mean, on the flip side of this, and I didn't want to do any more studies of cells, so I chose something a little bit more fancy because I like colors. So what this is called a DNA heat map, or and then you can run a DNA microarray. Basically, what it allows you to do, which I'm assuming nobody brought the telescope today to actually be able to read all these. But what it is it's a way to study genes, within a very large amount of genes on a single plate. And basically, what they found is this was studying, again, this is the Pritikin Research Group, and they study basically prostate cancer in men. So what you can really appreciate here is if you draw this imaginary line down here, on the left-hand side, you see a bunch of red. That is your meat eater group. On your right-hand side, you see a bunch of green. Same thing on this side, bunch of red, meat eater, bunch of green, plant eater. I mean, now that I think about it, they didn't tie the green to the plants, but I guess it makes sense. So. But anyhow, what you can really appreciate, though, is that from going from left to right, by switching to the plant-based diet, these genes, in a sense, red would be considered upregulated on the gene, and green would be downregulated, meaning on versus off, in a sense. This is a good way to think about it. So you can really appreciate, if you knew nothing else, just by the color differences, you have the downregulation of these genes by just switching from a diet. But now, somebody says, well, yeah, well, what if these are genes that may have absolutely no correlation to cancer, or they're just genes in your body? So, and that's kind of why I wish these were a little bit blown up. But you can see there's a lot of these genes that start with R's and R's and R's and R's. And these are your big RAS family oncogenes. So most people don't know much about the specific genes, but everybody, when you talk about cancer, you hear, oh, RAS, I've heard of that oncogene. A lot of these families of genes are RAS oncogenes, big driver genes in cancer production. They're all turned off by plant-based diet. Just like the breast cancer, 14 days. 14 days for men. And prostate cancer is very slow growing. A lot of the things they're advocating for now, watching weight approach. Why can't you switch your diet? I think about that all the time. Last thing I want to just touch on, so 2012, we talked about the Nurses' Health Study. This is also the Health Professional Follow-Up Study. All those two studies, basically kind of combining and conglomerating all their data. 37,000 men, 83,000 women. So you're talking 100,000 people. What did they find? Meat consumption is associated with an increased risk of total mortality, cardiovascular mortality, cancer mortality. But here's the kicker. This was after controlling for age, weight, alcohol, exercise, smoking, family history, caloric intake, even the intake of healthy plant foods, such as whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. So all they did, they took out all the extraneous factors that somebody could say, oh, that has an effect, this has an effect, and they left the meat and the risk for death. You can make the deductions yourself. So, thank you.
All right, so we're getting low on time, but we'll each kind of just briefly say our diet, maybe why a little bit, and then feel free to start raising your hands and ask questions, and pretty much anything goes. So I'm Rebecca. I don't think I introduced myself earlier, sorry. And I've been vegetarian. I don't even know how to quantify it because I've been a bit of a yo-yo vegetarian. So I tried as a teen and my parents would not allow it. We were a hunting family, and we still have lots of animals on our walls. My dad likes taxidermy. So I couldn't really do it until I got to college. So I started becoming vegetarian in college, and we kind of shift back and forth. And then I was strict vegan for a while, and right now I'm vegetarian, really hoping to be vegan. I'm really striving for that, but it is difficult sometimes. And I try more for whole food, plant-based, meaning like not processed foods either. There are vegetarian foods that are still unhealthy, that are that real processed food. So the whole food diet, which is plant-based, fresh foods, or raw food. No one else in my family really is vegetarian or vegan, so it can be a struggle, including my husband. So our house does have meat eating in it, and so it is difficult at times to make dinner. We basically make two different things, and our grocery shopping is pretty funny. If you look at our basket, it's like my plants and organic stuff, and then it's like Pringles and steak. My husband buys, so I'm sure it's confusing in there. My parents did actually recently become vegan, vegetarian, which is surprising, the hunting family. And it's because my dad was diagnosed with diabetes, and he was put on medication immediately, and he watched the documentary Forks Over Knives, which I highly recommend. And so he decided he did not want to be on all this medication, and he already was feeling horrible with diabetes. So he switched his diet to plant-based only, so pretty much vegan, pretty strict, and he started being more active hiking every day. And within 2 months, they took him off all of his medication, and he no longer has diabetes. And in fact, the original doctor he went back to is saying, maybe we misdiagnosed, is what they're saying maybe. So it's interesting. So, but it is funny, because when he goes into restaurants with us and orders vegetarian or vegan food, because he still has that very identity, like he does not care about the animal aspect, he will tell like the cashier that. Like he'll order the vegetarian dish and then be like, it's just for health reasons. I love that. I just wanted to share that.
So I think I mentioned I've been vegetarian for about 17 years now, so I started pretty young. So no meat, poultry, or fish. I try when I go grocery shopping to primarily shop vegan, but I'm not as good as Kenny on a strict vegan. So when I go out to restaurants, I don't always order a purely vegan dish, but I try to gravitate more toward the vegan lifestyle, especially as I get a little older. And again, I started out just kind of becoming more aware of what goes on in factory farming when I was a preteen teenager. And then, but now, kind of as we discussed, the environmental impact and all the health benefits have kind of kept me going. And I enjoy it. I've never had any deficiencies to speak of. I'm very active. I run, yoga, and I feel great.
Okay, so I said I've been vegetarian 25 years. When I met my wife, we were both transitional stage where we were not eating red meat at that time, but then quickly switched over to the vegetarian diet. And my Diet for a Small Planet book, I think I sold that in a yard sale. So we've got some of the books up here that we like as far as vegetarian books. If you guys want to take a look at them, that's fine. But when I was looking for mine, I found an extra copy of one of my favorites here, Moosewood Cookbook. So I'm going to do a giveaway here. And since I did the talk part on environmental impact, I'm going to give this to the person who consumed the least amount of gas on their way into work today. Okay, so you two think, and so which one of you used 0 gasoline on your way into work today? I thought it was going to be a foregone conclusion. Josh Rice is light, so there you go. All right. So we've been vegetarian for a long time, and I'm raising a vegetarian son. We're not forcing it on him, but we're not going to buy him a hamburger. So when he's old enough to spend his own money, he can if he wants, but he's been healthy here for 11 years without any problems, and I don't think he's going out and craving hamburgers since he's never had one. So that's about all I need to say. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes, go ahead.
I'm just interested, how does he do with his peers when he hangs out at friends' house and things like that?
That's a good question. So, and it's a good question for all of us. I'm from Tennessee, and so any time you get together, there's barbecue there. So there have been times when I've eaten, a bread sandwich, these kinds of things. And he does quite well, and that may be because he's in a little nerd school down the way, and it just so happens that his little cluster of friends, there are a lot of vegetarians in his world, so it's working out well for him. Good question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Follow-up question. Do you find that there's any age consequences if people make radical change? A person who's had a lifetime of meat-based diet, and then say in their 60s or 70s they change, or a person who's had just in their 20s or something like that. What's
As far as I can tell, only positive. And I went back and I watched the Forks Over Knives again last night just to refresh my memory on that. And so one of the ladies there was pretty old before she even started a plant-based diet in the documentary, and she had significant improvements in health. So
Where can you find that documentary?
it's right now it's streaming on Netflix. Yeah.
And I'll just go back and kind of back up Dr. Robinson and what he said is, anytime you make any sort of lifestyle or dietary change, there's no such thing as too late. I mean, I have read plenty of stories where people will be wheeled in on a wheelchair to these some-style lifestyle intervention, clinics, and they'll be walking out as healthy as can be. And these people have been, their death note has been signed. And it's amazing and profound. And some of the cancer studies that we did, you can even see that just a small period of time can make that change. So anything you can do positive for your health, whether it's diet, whether it's exercise, anything, sleeping better, everything will have an impact on your health, regardless of how old you are, how young you are, at any stage. And I can pretty definitively say that.
I actually will mention real fast since we're talking about the books. This is a very famous vegan chef and cookbook writer, Lily Patrick Boudreau. She has a podcast, she has all kinds of stuff. But this is specifically her book that came out not too long ago that's for non-vegetarians and vegans. And it's awesome. And it's 30 days. You basically challenge yourself to try veganism for 30 days. And she gives you all the details and background and recipes and menu ideas and grocery shopping, and there's pictures and graphs, and so it's really detailed. So it's made for someone to be able to pick up and read and look through it and make a menu and just try to be vegan for 30 days. So I recommend this.
And I think just to emphasize, just even making a
Any questions?
Would you please restate the egg cigarette
Oh,
ratio?
yeah. So back here, let me go back here. And so basically what they correlated this, and because they were able to take the risk factors and compare them to each other, basically they correlated. And again, I'm not saying that, you know, you're going to die the same way from egg versus smoking, but the risk factors were still the same. So, meaning the cholesterol found in a single egg, which I think is, say, 130 milligrams or whatnot, and again, that's yolk, obviously, because most of it's in the yolk versus the white anyway, was the same risk factor for death as was 5 cigarettes of smoking for 15 years. And that, to me, just blew my mind. I mean, obviously, you know, it does. What, single-legged egg,
One time.
meaning what, if you ate one egg, they're saying that cholesterol amount would be the same as if you were to go out, smoke 5 cigarettes a day, 15 years, and that would be the same risk for death. I mean, obviously you're not going to die from the same thing, but that's still the risk factor. So, it's amazing stuff. So.